Well, yes, Guy Vanderhaeghe is next to me. He is one of Saskatchewan's most prominent writers. You wouldn't know it, though, when you talk to him. He carries himself with the type of humility Saskatchewan people are so known for. It's almost cliche. But as you will hear from several people today, Guy Vanderhaeghe has played a critical role in helping us understand who we are here in Saskatchewan. He has a new book out today. It's called Because Somebody Asked Me To, Observations on History, Literature, and the Passing Scene. It's not a memoir, per se, but it also kind of is, because it's a collection of writing from his career of more than 40 years. These essays and speeches tell a bit of a story of who Guy Vanderhaeghe is, how he became a writer, and how his words have helped us shape an understanding of ourselves. So today, Guy Vanderhaeghe joins us for a feature interview on Blue Sky. We also have a copy of his book to give away to a listener. We'll make a draw after the show. All you have to do is tell us why you want to read the book. Email bluesky@cbc.ca and just make sure to include your mailing address in case your name is drawn. Well, let's get to it. Guy Vanderhaeghe, welcome to Blue Sky.
I'm very glad to be here.
It's lovely to have you, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. I just first want to start with the title of the book, because somebody asked me to, and when I called you ahead of the show, you said yourself, the book's kind of all over the place, and it kind of is. But what did someone ask you to do?
Well, over the years, I've been approached at various times to either comment or write about really disparate topics all over the place. Book reviews, do talks on history, do talks on creative writing, lecture for the Canadian Writers Union. And so when I was looking at all of these pieces, years and years ago, well, not years and years ago, maybe 10 years ago, someone suggested that I write a memoir. And I thought, no, because first of all, I've had a pretty boring life, right? So there wasn't too much exciting to inject into a memoir. But when I was looking back over these pieces, I started to think all of these different pieces said something about me. It said something about the place that I was born in, that I grew up in, that I was educated in. And aside from a very short stay in Ottawa in the 1980s, I've lived my entire life in this province. So place is really important to me. Mm-hmm. History is very important to me. And not just Saskatchewan history or Canadian history, but world history. And literature is important to me, even though I didn't major in English. I took a smattering of English classes, but I tried very hard. I still remember being in the University of Saskatchewan and walking down the class lists for English classes and thinking, I got to read this, I should read this. Mm-hmm. I wanted to educate myself, or at least self-educate myself in literature. Most of the pieces in this collection deal with that. A longer piece actually deals with my development as a writer, basically up until the time I published my first book. So this is probably the closest I will ever come to writing a memoir. And when I look at it, I'm sometimes surprised how forthright I was, because I tend to be pretty shy and reticent. But when I'm given a topic, that frees me, I think, to step back from myself and treat myself almost objectively as a subject.
You have so much to say. And, I was kind of laughing because I read a big chunk of this book outside in my car while my daughter was at gymnastics, and it was starting to get dark and I was hardly able to see, but I've folded over pages, I've underlined things, and you do have a lot to say, and you have a lot to say about this place. So when you talk about place, that is significant. And so when I now talk about waking up in the middle of the night to this thunderstorm and thinking of how you reflected on that in this in this book, but how have you tried to capture this place, Saskatchewan?
Well, I've tried to capture it in the only way that a writer can capture things, and that's through words. But I've also tried to make my writing as sensory as I possibly can. So I attempt to use words to engage all five senses. I used to say to my creative writing students that writers rely too much on their eye. You know, we have these other senses: hearing, smell, tactile things, touch. So it's one of the things I've tried to do as a writer, is that when I describe this place, whether it's in a novel or short stories or anything else, part of it's going to be visual. But part of it is also, my partner says that in one of my novels, someone is eating Saskatoon preserves, and they're sort of glorying in the taste of it. That's part of Saskatchewan too. You know, the taste of Saskatoons or home preserves, or in my grandmother's day, canning. And I have very powerful memories, which I think is true of almost everyone, about childhood. And the world I grew up in, I mean, people have said to me, how do you write a historical novel? And I often say, well, I kind of grew up in the 19th century, because my home didn't have an electric stove. It was a wood-burning stove. We did have electricity, but it was quite a while before we had a refrigerator or a television. Never had a television until I was 13 years old. Outdoor toilets. And people still tended to work, certainly not completely, but tended to work with horses. So that seems like a very distant time, from, given where we find ourselves now. But for me, those are all very powerful memories.
So tell me about growing up. Like, who were you as a kid? Your parents, did they encourage you to read and write? Or what was your upbringing like?
My mother was a huge advocate for education. And she used to say, I don't care what you read. It was a long time before the town I grew up in had a library. And it was one of those libraries where you signed books out yourself. There wasn't a librarian. She didn't care what I read. Like, teachers used to say I was reading things that were far too adult. But she didn't care what I read. My father, on the other hand, regrettably was basically functionally illiterate. And I think that he would have been happy or happier if I stayed where I was born and maybe farmed or worked in the mine. He didn't certainly put himself in the way of what I did, but I don't think he ever got it, and I don't blame him when I'm saying that he didn't get it. He never read anything that I wrote because he couldn't. When I was a kid, he used to take me along when I was 10 or 11 years old if he was buying cattle for me to write the checks. My mother did all of those sorts of things in the household. But, if she wasn't there to do it, then I became the designated or delegated secretary.
So is it, when you reflect, when you look back, is it quite surprising to you that you've had the career that you've had?
Yes and no. I mean, again, I think we tell the story of our life from the point we find ourselves at. That is, we look back at all the things that led us to where we are. We don't look at the things that might have taken us in a different direction. So I was intensely interested in reading from the time that I could read. I was intensely interested in stories. And I grew up in an oral tradition where especially my mother's brothers and my mother herself were great storytellers. They were like stand-up comics. And it was all very polished.
Yeah.
Like they were terrific. So I grew up respecting storytelling. I grew up intensely interested in reading. And I harbored, at a very early age, I harbored a desire to be a writer. It's sort of, there's a family story about me. Like you wonder if it actually happened. But when I was a little kid, my grandfather said to me, "So what do you want to be, Guy, when you grow up? Prime Minister?" He was joking. And I said, "I don't think I come from the right kind of family." And that story was told over and over, to me when I don't know how old I was, maybe 6 or 7 when I said that. So there are all sorts of improbabilities to me becoming a writer. But I can trace a thread that brought me to where I am now. A lot of it was luck. There are a lot of ways I could have gone off the rails, and I didn't. And I always say that my mother was my biggest piece of luck because she pushed education. She, I think, like a lot of women of her generation, during the Second World War, she had been in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and she was a sergeant major. She was a sergeant major at home, I'll add. There was no question about who was in charge. But then when the war was over, she was expected to go back to being a very conventional woman, a 1950s idea of what women should be. Yeah. And I think that really rankled. And I think it really bothered her. And I think to a certain degree she put some of her ambitions onto me in the sense that she wanted certain things and she transferred that desire onto me.
What kind of a responsibility did you feel in writing about places in Saskatchewan? You have an essay in here that writers before you were reluctant to name cities like Winnipeg, Edmonton, Regina, Saskatoon. And so I'm curious about writers, your generation of writers and the responsibility you felt to tell a story about here.
Well, now I'm going to make a confession. Mm-hmm. In my first novel, I failed that test that I set other writers. In many ways, it's clearly Saskatoon, but I don't say Saskatoon. Mm-hmm. Now, backing up, for my generation of writers, we had a very strong sense about the cultural hegemony of the United States, and we had a feeling that we had to define ourselves culturally to actually be a nation. That was important, and that Canadian literature should be taught in schools, in universities, that Canadian art should be part of curricula, all the rest of it. So that was one thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing was that people from the regions looked on Toronto as if it was operating like a mini United States, as if it was shutting out voices from other parts of the country, because
we still feel that way.
Yeah, well, exactly. But the old picture in the cartoon of the 1930s was a cow straddling the provinces. The Saskatchewan farmer is feeding the cow hay, and the udder is in Ontario, and an Ontario banker is milking it, right? So we have a long history of grievance in this province. So I think we consciously decided that we needed to write this place. There were people who had done it before us. W.O. Mitchell, and Sinclair Ross. But the new generation of writers, I think, wanted to do it with more intensity, and to sort of map the whole area more thoroughly. In many ways, that was naive, right? There's a kind of element of self-promotion that sometimes loses sight of what writing or art should be about. But I think it was really healthy. And there were people, for instance, the foundation of Grain Literary Magazine, where I published my first short story, the creation of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. That was really foundational. And if you look around the province now, and even the more recent past, we have had nationally celebrated writers of nonfiction, of poetry, of fiction. There were a lot of, I would say, empty spaces in the literary map of Saskatchewan. And I don't want to suggest that it's been completed, or if it's ever going to be completed. For instance, in the early 1970s, what I'm talking about, there was virtually no Indigenous writing. And now there's a huge surge of Indigenous writers and literature. So that's another part of the map that was neglected that's now getting filled in.
We're going to hear from many of the writers that you will know well, colleagues and friends who have something to share, Guy, with you. And so we're going to get to that. Actually, let's start with the first voice. So we wanted to hear what other people had to say about your writing. And we've collected a series of notes from people. So let's start with Dee Hobsbawm-Smith.
Hi, my name is Dee Hobsbawm-Smith, and I am a Saskatchewan writer, a poet, an essayist, a writer of fiction, and a writer of food. It has been my pleasure to work with Guy Vanderhaeghe, to attend classes with him at the University of Saskatchewan. So a lot of my experience of Guy as someone who has shaped the Saskatchewan landscape is of how he helped me shape my own literary writing skills. I think that Guy is an influencer way beyond the common and current view of what an influencer is. He understands people and the geography of people and the motivations of people. And I think that's a really good way in to the way that people inhabit places, because motivation is what drives us, and motivation is what drives good fiction. So for that, and for his wonderful contributions, I think he's one of the best novelists in the country. For those things, I am really grateful that Guy has written such wonderful books and continues to write such wonderful books.
So that is Dee Hobsbawm-Smith. She called you an influencer. I don't know if anybody's ever called you that before.
I was
liked
saying
that.
I'm lucky I'm on radio because I'm blushing.
I can tell you're blushing. And there's more. Just wait.
God, dear.
I'm Leisha Gravinsky. You are listening to Blue Sky, and our guest for the whole show is Guy Vanderhaeghe. His new book is out. It's called Because Somebody Asked Me To. Well, we asked a bunch of writers to call in Guy. And so here's another writer that you will know well.
My name is David Carpenter. I'm a writer, and I've been reading Guy Vanderhaeghe's work for a very long time. I think he's absolutely the greatest writer our province has ever given birth to, and I'm sure that he's had an impact on the way I think about Saskatchewan. I grew up in Alberta and came to Saskatchewan in 1975, and when I laid hold of his first short stories in Man Descending and his first novels, I could see that he had a very good ear for human speech, a very good eye for the terrain, and it's almost as though by getting to know his characters, I got to know the province where I would be spending the rest of my life. And if I had to summarize his view of the province, I would say that he had a hard-scrabble vision of Saskatchewan life, not just his parents' memories of the 30s, say, but right into contemporary times. And he's a historical novelist, so he goes back into hard-scrabble times in his novels about Mounties and Indigenous people in the 19th century. I think Guy knows that in Saskatchewan we don't have a long history of expectant capitalism like Alberta does. Optimism doesn't do well in Saskatchewan, and I think Guy wouldn't use these words. I'm just using my words to come to terms with him. But optimism in Saskatchewan is kind of foolish. It should be a sort of guarded hope close to despair. And I love the real edge on life that Vanderhaeghe leaves with us.
That is writer David Carpenter. Guy Vanderhaeghe, you're with me here in studio. Optimism doesn't do well in Saskatchewan. What do you think?
I think that we live in hope. Hope often defeated. We go through those commodity ups that are like sugar highs, and I sometimes think that we delude ourselves that the sugar high is going to last forever, and then we come back down to earth with a thump. But the one thing I think that this province and this people is resilient. I once gave a talk for the Walrus magazine, which is in here, where I talked about resilience, and I said people don't bounce back from a big success. That what often forms us is our failures and our defeats. Now, failure and defeat can crush you, but as Nietzsche said, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. And we've had a lot of bad times in this province. And I think it's bred a certain, what I would call agrarian stoicism in the population. We pick ourselves up and we get back to work. I don't think that aside from the temporary bursts of boosterism, which say we're on the up and up and we're never going to come down, I don't think we believe it. And because we don't believe it, I think we are closer to reality. I don't want to disparage Californians, but I'll say Californians.
Part of the reason why we wanted to reach out to writers is because you have a story in here about a letter you received from Margaret Lawrence. Not everybody gets a letter from Margaret Lawrence. Do you want to tell that story and what that meant to you?
Well, it was a very odd circumstance because my first book won the Governor General's Award, which was, at that time, the Governor General's Award was just about the only literary prize in Canada that had any weight to it. And winning it gave me a lot of self-doubt because a lot of people said what was true. One of the other writers nominated for that prize was Alice Munro, and we had both published collections of short stories. Alice Munro went on to win the Nobel Prize on the strength of her short stories. She's a master of the short story. There's nobody, I don't think that there's anybody writing in English when she was alive who was her equal. So I knew I shouldn't have won that prize. Now, I was glad I won the prize, right? Because it was a chunk of money, and I needed a chunk of money, and it was a career boost. So I was glad, but I was also guilty. And that that kind of threw me into a funk. You know, I felt like a fraud. I felt like I pulled the wool over people's eyes. Then out of the blue, a letter arrived. It had been sent to my publisher, and then it was forwarded to me, and it was from Margaret Lawrence. The letter said, "I hope you don't mind an older writer giving you some advice." Okay, so she gave me advice, very good advice. Now, I can't remember it all verbatim, but a number of years ago, I got the letter from the archives in Calgary to check what she said in it. So, you know, the gist of what she was saying to me was that nothing is important except the work. That everything else around is not very important. That the focus needs to be on the work. And then she ended the letter by saying to me, which sort of stunned me, "I want to give you my blessing because you have the gift." Okay? And she said that she had got a letter when she was a young writer from Ethel Wilson, who was a British Columbia writer, and, you know, an important writer at that time. At that point, Margaret Lawrence was sort of like the matriarch of Canadian letters, right? And so her letter kind of pulled me out of the funk I was in, and I said, I just have to forget about everything else. I have to forget about winning this prize. I have to forget about what people might be saying about me winning this prize. What I need to do is go on to the next book and to say to myself, hope that every book that you write is a better book than the last book. And that without that, there is not much point to doing this. It takes me a long time to write a book because if I were to pat myself on the back, books with me are like people parallel parking cars, right?
Okay.
No, you get to the point when you say, that's the best I can do, right? This is as close to the curb as I can get.
Yeah.
You know, you'd like to be absolutely flush with maybe like 2 inches, right? But you're not going to get there, but this is the best you can do with this car at this moment with this positioning. But I used to tell young writers, don't give up too soon. Don't say something's good enough too soon. Because often you can make it better.
Okay, let's go to another writer who has something to say. This is, well, she'll introduce herself. Let's take a listen.
Hi, it's Lorna Crozier. I'm speaking to you from Vancouver Island, where I now live, but of course I was born and raised in Saskatchewan. And I think one of the most important writers, not only in the province, but in the country and in the world, let's be, honest about this, is Guy Vanderhaeghe. What I love so much about his work is that he can be deeply serious. He writes about the past, and he shows how the past creates and forms the present. And he gives us present-day Saskatchewan life in a way nobody else does. So he can write with such great seriousness, but there is always a twinkle in his eye. He's a comic writer at heart, one that shows great wit and satirical brilliance. I think Guy has affected Saskatchewan writing by just writing so brilliantly. We all have to live up to the bar that he has set so high. I'm proud to be his friend and proud to be a fellow Saskatchewanian. Our province is a great place when it helps produce people like Guy.
Okay. Lorna and I appeared I think for the first time in the same issue of Grain.
Yeah.
It was the second issue, and she had poetry in there, and I had a short story, terrible short story, a really bad short story. Her poetry was way, way better than my short story. But I mean, I think, I think that Lorna and all these writers who are calling in and speaking have shared the same attitude that I do, and that is that the work is what you dedicate yourself to. You don't dedicate yourself to the persona. I think that there are people who want to be writers not because they want to write, but they imagine that writers live this. I watched this show called The Perfect Couple on Netflix, this week, and there's a best-selling mystery writer in the thing, and she's having this incredible book launch. Champagne, oysters, balloons that come down, a marching band, all the rest of it. I think that some people imagine that's what it means to be a writer.
And that didn't ring true in your life, or that was what your life looked like.
Okay, here's something I did years ago. Maddie Teen, who's a very celebrated writer now. She was my assistant when I was teaching at Booming Ground in BC at UBC. Mm-hmm. She got an acceptance for her first book when we were there. So what I did was, to celebrate it, I bought her a bottle of champagne and then a big can of Spam that I put birthday candles in and lit.
Yeah.
And I said, Here's the champagne. That's tonight. And you got the acceptance. The Spam is what comes after, right? The Spam is reality.
Yeah. Sadly, though, a little bit, right? Like you think about I think of just how important writers are to us, but it's a grind. It's the financial compensation maybe isn't what everybody wants it to be to try and make a living. So it's kind of it's something to reflect on. I think if we're talking about the value that you've brought to this province, it's an interesting thing to contemplate.
I'm not speaking myself now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But again, in another piece in this book, I say that what artists do is that they create cultural capital that the future banks on. Okay, so the Irish writer James Joyce, they would not publish him in Ireland because he was considered immoral. Okay? Now the Irish Tourist Board runs these big tours on Bloomsday, which is based on something in his novel Ulysses, in which they take groups of tourists around to all the places mentioned in the novel Ulysses, right? Mm-hmm. The Eiffel Tower, the population of Paris was outraged by the Eiffel Tower, and the only reason that they came to sort of accept it for the exposition was because they were promised it would be torn down.
And now,
what is the biggest? What is the biggest one, or one of the biggest tourist attractions in Paris? The Eiffel Tower.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, it's so interesting to think about that. Okay, we have another person who called. Let's take a listen.
Hi, I'm Michelle Good, author of 5 Little Indians and Truth Telling, 7 Conversations on Indigenous Life in Canada. I'm a Saskatchewan writer and had the great pleasure of reading Guy's work, August into Winter. And it was one of the most profound things I've read. I had a reaction to it that I've never had to another book that I read. I could smell the prairie. I could smell that August heat that is so unique to Saskatchewan. And I think one of the things that his amazing writing does is it articulates the subtle beauty of Saskatchewan, of the prairies, of the grasslands. And I think we are so much enriched by his work. I am an advocate and a lover of historical fiction because what it gives is people of different generations get to experience what that time may have been like, even though they didn't live through it. And we constantly, it seems a little obvious to say, but we constantly need to be reminded of the history of the places where we live. Otherwise, we really can't understand how we've come to where we are and where we need to go. So I think the fact that he's writing historical fiction is just a boon all the way around.
It's Michelle Good. I do want to hear you speak to that, the importance of understanding our history, how the past informs the present.
Yeah, I mean, because I studied history, I have a very strong sense that we don't know who we are without a memory. And that's with individuals too. I mean, I think one of the unfortunate things that occurs sometimes by accident, by aging or whatever, is that people lose their connection with the past. And in many ways, the past is what you are. That's true of nations too, and that's true of peoples. Now, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that history is codified, that there is one history that tells our story. I often think of history like a court case. And what you do is you examine evidence and then you interpret it to arrive at conclusions. But we acquire more evidence over time, and the acquisition of more evidence changes the interpretation. Now, I've spoken about Indigenous writing. When I first studied history at university, there was virtually no recognition of the role of Indigenous people in the development of the country, what the country meant, what the relationship was between settlers and Indigenous people, and all the rest of it. The acquisition of knowledge that in many ways was forced on us by Indigenous activists should make us, and I think is making us, attempt to revise our understanding of that past and how that past led us to where we are. That's why it's so fundamentally important. And I also think that it's important because it's a way of thinking. Okay? The examination of evidence and drawing conclusions from it, I think for students, teaches them flexibility. It teaches them empathy because they have to understand different points of view, or should attempt to understand different points of view. And they should also attempt to understand motivation and character. I actually took as my writing mantra a thing from a Canadian historian, Donald Creighton, who said, character and circumstance and how they mingle or mesh is essentially a story. And that story is the story of history. I took that for writing fiction and I said, you have certain kinds of characters, you put them in this situation, you get this result. Mm-hmm. You put them in a different situation, you get a different result. Which means that all of these connections, okay, they're diverse, they're multiple. You know, we can't arrive at, sometimes people speak of true history. We can only arrive at a truer history because that history is going to be continually revised.
Because you went back through so much of your writing for this book, and I know we're not talking about your novels in this book. This is a different kind of writing, this collection here. Do you have stories that didn't age well?
Yeah. I mean, what I tried to do, I suppose, if I look back on my fiction, okay, there are things that I did which I wouldn't do now. And there are things in this book that I left more or less the way they were. And maybe my opinion would be better, would be different now. But that's also the part of, that's my argument about being human. We change. There's usually an essential kind of character or personality in, I believe, in individuals. Okay, and that's sort of the bedrock and the groundwork of a person becoming the person that they are. But you revise that over time. You know, you learn things. You have experiences that sort of adjust you. I think probably I think maybe my opinions might be slightly more generous now than they were when I was a young man.
I wish people could see the smile on your face right now. Okay, we have a couple more writers who called in, so let's take a listen.
My name is Dave Margocious. I'm a fiction writer and poet living in around Saskatoon. I moved to Saskatchewan in 1986 from Vancouver. I didn't know anything about Saskatchewan except for having read W.O. Mitchell and Sinclair Ross and Guy Vanderhaeghe. The three of them gave me not a 100% accurate necessarily view of Saskatchewan, but glimpses of different aspects of life in this province. And when I knew I was moving to Saskatchewan in the days before the move and in the days after my arrival in Regina, I reread some of Mitchell and some of Sinclair Ross. And at that point, Guy only had 2 books published, both short story collections, and I read both of those again. They're wonderful. They are amazingly good short stories. One of them, as people probably know, his very first book published, Man Descending, won a Governor General's Award, which is pretty unheard of, a first book winning an award like that. Anyway, over the years I've read a lot of Guy's work, and I really consider him up there along with Mitchell and Ross, the 3 top writers from Saskatchewan, and, well, among the small group of top writers of Canada. And he's still at it. Long may he go.
It's Dave Margocious. Are you loving this or are you hating this?
It's very flattering. It's probably too flattering. I might need to buy a bigger hat when I leave here, because the head may be swelling to enormous proportions.
Just wait, because we have one more.
Oh dear.
Okay, let's listen.
Okay.
When I moved to Saskatoon 22 years ago now, I heard of Guy and realised that he was someone my stepfather had really enjoyed reading. He talked to me lots about Guy's books and how they shaped his understanding of the prairies, which in turn shaped mine, this balance of history and literary and bringing human memory and connection into a place where it can be distilled and discussed far away from Saskatoon, all the way on the other side of the world, and yet really help us see what these prairies and this place can be, has been a real bonus of moving and living in this province. Thanks.
It's writer Ellis Kuipers. So, Guy, to maybe keep you humble, I know in our business we might put together a great show, we tell a great story, and then someone will come up and say, "Well, what's your next story? What are you doing next?" So, before your head inflates far too much, what are you working on right now? What's going to be next after this one?
Well, I mean, I am slogging away at a novel, but
You are, hey?
Yeah, I tend to think of myself as semi-retired, so I indulge myself in the summer. I play way too much golf and do too little work. But I suspect when the snow flies, it will be easier for me to put my nose to the grindstone. I don't know. I hope so.
Sounds like a very Saskatchewan time to write, to wait for the winter and cozy up and do some writing. Guy, this has been a real treat. I love this. I could sit and talk to you all day, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I don't know what I'm going to say when I run into these people face to face and have to thank them. I guess thank them. I'll have to.
That's all just say thanks and
thanks.
Carry on. Guy Vanderhaeghe, everyone. His new book is called Because Somebody Asked Me To, Observations on History, Literature, and the Passing Scene. I'm Alicia Gravinsky. I'll be back here tomorrow. We're talking about UFOs. You're going to have to tune in for this one. A fascinating piece of Saskatchewan history that's getting a bit of attention right now. So that's coming up on the next Blue Sky right here on CBC Radio 1. Have a wonderful afternoon.